So yeah, it's absolutely astonishing because it really fires up your imagination. Everybody starts to think, well, what was this like? What would it have been like standing on the side of this kind of rift on the Rio Grande Rise when it was subaerial? Can you imagine like a jungle looking out across this 8-10 kilometer wide kind of canyon, which would have had a sea in its own right, and you could see maybe the other side of the tropical. It's the sort of thing where might have Indiana Jones on a rope bridge,
Exactly,
trying to cross.
Yeah.
Welcome back to the National Oceanography Centre's Into the Blue podcast, where we talk to the people leading the way in raising the profile of the ocean through research, exploration and advocacy. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Hello, I'm Dr. Zoe Jacobs, and today I'm joined by Professor Bramley Murton to discuss how he helped discover a lost tropical island off the coast of Brazil and how scientific and geological research led to its discovery. So hello, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
So before we get started, I thought it'd be quite a good idea to maybe talk about your career background and your role at NOC.
Yeah, well, I'm a marine geologist. I started off as a land-based geologist, largely fascinated by what we're actually standing on and walking around on as a planet. And so after my first degree in Edinburgh, I went on to do a PhD at the Open University with a Professor Ian Gass, studying something called an ophiolite. And an ophiolite is an uplifted bit of ocean crust. It's forming mountains. And I was walking around in Cyprus on the mountains and became astonished by the idea that I was walking around on the ancient ocean floor. So much so that a few years later, I was given a chance to go on a thing called a research cruise by a guy called Lindsay Parson, who I met at a conference in London. And we went out to Tonga and to the West Pacific, and we used something called a side scan sonar, which imaged the seafloor. And I was absolutely astonished to see miles below us all these volcanoes and things, just like the sort of thing I've been seeing in Cyprus. And so that kind of got me into the marine geology field, and I've been doing that ever since. At NOC at the moment, I am the specialist in running the marine minerals group. So we look at mineral deposits, like in hydrothermal systems and the volcanoes that generate them, and where they are and where they form and how long they formed for. So that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Cool. So before we kind of get into the discovery that we're going to talk about, that actually happened in 2018. So if we jump back to 2018, can you tell us a bit about the project that involved some seafloor exploration?
Yeah, so back in 2018, we had a project called Marine E-Tech. It was a bilateral project between the UK and the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil, University of Sao Paulo. And primarily we were looking at the formation of what we call ferromanganese cobalt-rich crusts, which is a bit of a mouthful. But basically it's a sort of like it's a black, crusty substance which sits on the seafloor, grows over many, many millions of years. And it's fascinating for a number of reasons. But one is because it could be potentially a source of cobalt and these critical metals for the green energy revolution, but also because they provide very interesting records of what's happened in the ocean over the last 100 million years, for example. So we were looking at places like Tropic Seamount in the northeast Atlantic, and we also looked at, as a comparison, an area in the South Atlantic called the Rio Grande Rise, which is about 1,200 kilometers away from Brazil.
Okay, so were there any partners or organisations involved in this research? I guess you already mentioned.
That's right. Yeah. So my good friend Luigi from the University of Sao Paulo, and his team of scientists. We had two cruises. So we had one to the Tropic Seamounts in the northeast Atlantic, and then we had this other one down in the southwest on the Rio Grande Rise, and that involved a lot of the Brazilians. Great bunch of people to work with, very enthusiastic. In an area which very, very little work has been done before. So, kind of like a pure discovery expedition in that sense. I mean, we knew a little bit about the geology, but enough to make a proposal for a cruise, but no one had really visited in the way that we had before.
I imagine kind of any seafloor expedition, there could be kind of all kinds of different things that you might stumble across while you're on this cruise. And now you did actually make another discovery while you're down there.
Yeah, exactly, Zoe. So if I step back a little bit, in terms of the way we approach science these days, you can't just wander off and say, you know, can you lend me a ship for a month?
Yeah.
I'm just going to dob around.
Yeah.
So I can
Just go see what I can find. Yeah.
Exactly. So we have what's called hypothesis-driven science.
Yeah.
Hypothesis-driven science is where you come up with an idea and you go out there with the objective of testing that hypothesis. Is it right or is it wrong? And so on. But whenever we go out, despite the hypothesis, we always discover something completely unexpected and new.
That's really cool, though.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And kind of the exploration is always there. And it's kind of not the overt driver, but it's the thing that really makes a lot of this, you know, my colleagues, myself, you know, fascinated. It's what kind of motivates us in many ways. You go down and you see a bit of the seafloor. No human beings ever seen before. You're seeing things that nobody has ever seen before. And because the planet is, 3/4 covered by ocean, there's an awful lot of stuff that no one has seen before. So not surprisingly, you come across things which, you know, are kind of really, really unexpected and unusual. Yeah,
absolutely. So you went to do this expedition to look at some kind of seafloor deposits. You found something else.
Yeah.
What was it?
So if I give a little bit of background about the Rio Grande Rise, it's 1,200 kilometers off the west coast of Brazil. It's what's called the Large Igneous Province. Large igneous provinces are generated by large outflowings of lava many millions of years ago. A current one would be Iceland, actually.
Okay.
It's a large igneous province.
Yeah.
It's a volcanic plateau that's generated by eruptions above the Icelandic plume, which is sitting underneath the center of Iceland and has been going on for about 50 million years. The Rio Grande Rise is a similar sort of phenomena. It's a large igneous province and it forms this large plateau underwater. It formed about 80 million years ago with a hot spot, which is a rising mantle plume, very close to the mid-Atlantic ridge at that time. And this sort of large outpouring of lava generated something about 5 times the size of Iceland. And as the plates moved and the South Atlantic opened up, so it got further and further away from the mid-Atlantic ridge to a position where it more or less is now. So we knew about that, and people learned about the Rio Grande Rise. And what we were going to do is go out there and actually look for the ferromanganese crusts, which are sort of sitting on top, and learn a little bit about how they've formed and how they're preserved. So we took with us remotely operated vehicles. These are like sort of submersibles which hang on the end of the wire, and we sort of steer them and drive around. We took an autonomous underwater vehicle, and that mapped the seabed. A previous expedition a few years before with our Brazilian colleagues had gone out and mapped the seafloor from the ship using something called swath sonar. So we had nice maps in which to work from. And then we put these instruments down, these vehicles down, which could look in much more detail at the seafloor. So that's what we were doing.
Amazing. And you discovered something cool.
We discovered something cool. So, so what were we doing? So we were looking at this thing called a Rio Grande. It has a big rift in the middle, like a Grand Canyon, and it's like a crack which runs for about 60 or 70 kilometers. It's about 10 kilometers wide and about 300 meters deep. It's got vertical walls, so it's kind of like a big Grand Canyon, if you want.
Yeah, that's what I'm picturing right now.
So we were zooming down the wall of this Grand Canyon, looking at layer upon layer upon layer of lava flows which had been erupted during the formation of this plateau. And a couple of things we noticed which were rather strange. One was that they had polygonal faulting or polygonal jointing, which is a kind of jointing you see on the Giant's Causeway in Ireland.
Oh, right, yeah.
And it's kind of typical of subaerial lava flows, but not submarine ones, because submarine lavas tend to form what we call pillow lavas, quite different. But even more amazing was between the pillow lavas, we saw these red beds. Now, these red beds are kind of like red clay features. They sit between the lava flows. And although you do get clays in the very deep ocean, you don't really get red clays in the shallower waters. We're at about 1,000 meters here. And you certainly don't get red clays between lava flows in underwater eruptions. The only place you really get that is if you look at lava flows which erupted, say, in a tropical zone, in subaerially, and you had tropical weathering, which kind of basically erodes and weathers the top of the lava flows before the next one comes along. And so this is what we saw. So we thought this is rather fascinating. So we started to take some samples of these red muds, red clays. And one of Luigi's students was able to do the clay analysis and do other analysis, and discovered that these clays are predominantly made out of something called kaolinite, which is the characteristic weathering of subtropical aerial weathering. So, hey ho, that means that these lavas, although 1,000 meters below sea level now, must have been erupted, in some kind of tropical environment, subaerially. So it was part of an island. So the Rio Grande Rise, we could see now, was definitely, at the time that these lavas erupted, was a subaerial tropical island, a big island, like the size of Iceland. It's not a small dot, it's quite a big thing. And also when we were looking at these red beds, we also saw these donut-shaped concretions, which turn out to be possibly the fossil roots of little trees and things like this. We also went, as we were going down the walls of this canyon, we saw, we won't call fossilized now, but we saw waterfalls, or what were waterfalls, where water had cascaded down and eroded into on the floor of the Rio Grande Rise, which is quite flat. We saw these circular sinkholes about 100 meters wide, and went down in those, and we could see that these were dissolution holes. It's called karst topography. So it's a limestone sort of floor of this canyon, and this is generated by fresh water, which has formed caves, and the caves are so everything is telling us that this is once a tropical island, a large, almost a small mini continent, and you're sitting there in the middle of the South Atlantic.
That's really cool. I'm literally imagining what this island would look like, because you've painted quite a nice picture there of kind of the size of Iceland, or bigger than Iceland.
That's the size of Iceland, we think.
The size of Iceland in the tropics. There were trees, possibly palm trees.
Lush green forest.
Waterfalls.
The lava flows and these red beds are 40 million years old.
Wow.
Yeah, so we're talking,
quite a long time ago.
Yeah, quite a long time ago. So the vegetation would have looked similar to what we have today in the tropics, but obviously very, very slightly different. But yes, that's what it would look like. It would have been a dense jungle, tropical jungle with, high temperatures, rainfall, high humidity, warm seas, and the bottom of this rift, which I was talking about, would have been a shallow sea in this rift, with limestone forming. Much like you have in the tropics today, sort of coral limestones and things like this. So yes, that's what it would have been like. And this is 40 million years ago. Subaerial, so somewhere in the South Atlantic, 40 million years ago, large island like Iceland, sitting there, probably had lots of animals and things as well, living amongst the forests.
Yeah, that's really impressive. So what did it feel like to make that kind of discovery?
Yeah, it's astonishing, isn't it? Because what you see on the seafloor is it's the frozen tropical island as it was, as it kind of subsided below sea level, a bit like an Atlantis. I mean, apart from the things I just described about, we could see old beaches. So there are terraces.
Wow.
You could see the cobblestones where the waves had cut back, and so you got these wave cut platforms and beaches and things like this, and see these river features and these waterfall like features. So yeah, it's absolutely astonishing, because it really fires up your imagination. Everybody started to think, well, what was this like? What would it have been like standing on the side of this kind of rift on the Rio Grande Rise when it was subaerial? Can you imagine like a jungle looking out across this 8-10 kilometer wide kind of canyon, which would have had a sea in it in its own right, and you could see maybe the other side of tropical. It's the sort of thing where might have Indiana Jones on a rope bridge,
exactly,
trying to cross. But it's astonishing, because remember we're 1,200 kilometers away from land. We're in the middle of the ocean. It's 1,000 meters down. I mean, the ocean is just the ocean everywhere. It's just waves and water, but underneath you've got what was this frozen in time tropical island that's now just sitting there, frozen in aspect, so to speak. Yeah.
Is this something that's been discovered before, this kind of thing? Are there other kind of islands that have been lost to the sea?
Well, yes and no. I mean, way back in the 60s, when people first started mapping the ocean floor,
Yeah.
getting soundings from the sea floor, it was noticed that there are underwater volcanoes or underwater seamounts. Some of them look like conical volcanoes, great volcanoes. Some of them had flat tops, and these are called guyots.
Okay.
And the flat-topped seamounts have volcanic basement and coral reef limestone on the top. So even then, people were thinking, well, these must have been drowned islands. Once they were a volcanic island, and then they got cut by the waves until the top cut off, it's flat, and then it became an atoll, coral reefs, and then slowly subsiding. So a lot of the Pacific islands will do the same. They'll become atolls. A lot of them are atolls now, and given time, they will just subside beneath sea level. And so people known about these, but the scale of this Rio Grande Rise is much bigger than these little islands. This is a huge sort of landscape, hundreds of miles across.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings me to my next question. Why did it disappear? Why is it now 1,000 meters down?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Okay, so if we go back to the theory of plate tectonics, okay, so we have, a good question is, why do we have the oceans? If we think about that, not why we have land, but why do we have oceans? The reason we have oceans is because in between the continental crust, there's oceanic crust, which is much denser, albeit thinner, and it's being generated at mid-ocean ridges. So the reason why continents appear to move around is because at mid-ocean ridges, new crust is being generated by lavas and by volcanoes. It's 1,200 degrees centigrade. And somewhere in the trenches, for example, around the Pacific, that crust is being consumed. And so because of the various motions, the continents will move around, but the new crust is being formed at the ridges. Now, the new crust starts off being very hot. And things that are hot are less dense than things that get cooler. So as the crust moves away from the ridge, it gets colder and denser, and because of that, it sinks. So if you've got islands which are built close to the ridge axis, volcanoes or the Rio Grande Rise, as it moves away from the ridge axis and the lithosphere gets colder, it subsides away. And so the subsidence is several hundreds or over 1,000 meters in, say, 50 million years. So everything is on the ocean crust. It's basically subsiding. And sea level rises have an effect, and they can do two things. You can have the subsidence of something like the Rio Grande Rise, and you can have changes in sea level. And if the changes in sea level are kind of keeping pace with the subsidence, then you have more time for the waves, if you like, to cut platforms and cut beaches. And if it's going the other way around, then the apparent sea level change will be quite quick on the subsiding island. But it's a function of the plate tectonics.
And what effect would this sinking island have had on the ocean or the kind of surrounding marine ecosystems?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's not really my field because I'm a geologist, but according to some of my Brazilian colleagues who are oceanographers or paleoceanographers, the formation of the Rio Grande Rise near the ridge axis generated not just the Rio Grande Rise, but it also generated something called the Walvis Ridge. And it also generated a bit of a sort of ridge, underwater ridge as well, which links ultimately onto the Rio Grande Rise. And that elevated structure apparently had quite a strong influence in terms of Atlantic overturning and the circulation and the mixing of the oceans, especially the mixing of Antarctic waters into the North Atlantic waters. So these features on the seabed can have quite profound effects on the circulation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you kind of touched on it earlier, but so the RRS Discovery was involved in this expedition, and one or two of our ROVs were involved in this expedition.
One of our ROVs.
How big a role did they play in the kind of discovery of the island?
So we took an ROV called the Hibis system. Which actually I was kind of responsible for inventing.
That was your job. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
A few years ago. Built by a lovely company here in the UK called Hydrolec. that played an enormous part because that was the first time we actually were able to go down and see the seabed and actually take samples in situ. So if I put this into context, what people have done traditionally, and certainly on the Rio Grande Rise, all they had done in the past was to drag a bucket.
Okay.
And they drag it across the seabed and they bring it up and they go, oh yeah, we've got some rocks in here. And you say, oh, that's great. Where did they come from? Well, they sort of came from the last
general
few
area,
miles of the seabed. You don't really see the context. But using the ROV, though, you can go down and you can actually see the things in context and you can pick the rocks. So you can pick the lava flow and you can pick the red clay bed underneath it. And so you've got everything. It's like being a geologist on the seabed. You can actually sample the things and see the context, which is absolutely... without that, you can't really make this interpretation. If we just grabbed a bit of red clay and a bit of lava, so what? You know, it's actually seeing the context of the red clays in between the lava flows that makes all the difference.
Absolutely. So what were the kind of main conclusions of the study?
What, in terms of the Rio Grande Rise, or in terms of
all of it?
All
kind
of
of the expedition, the discovery of the island. What were the kind of, I guess I was going to say highlights, but I guess the highlight probably was the discovery of this island.
Well, there are several highlights.
Yeah.
I mean, one was, the primary purpose we had was to look for the ferromanganese crust, and we learned a lot about those. We learned a lot about the oceanographic conditions under which they were forming and how they were being preserved or otherwise. Other highlights that came out of that was the discovery of a trilobite, which is a fossil from about 450 million years ago, sitting on the Rio Grande Rise, which is only like 40 to 80 million years old. And it turned out that we had evidence of ice rafting. So if you imagine icebergs coming up from Antarctica and melting and dropping boulders to the seabed. So we discovered say evidence of that, which is quite a long way north. And so we're going up to quite low latitudes, much lower latitudes than people thought ice rafted material was going for. But yeah, I think some of the big finds were really just this whole drowned island, drowned continent discovery. It's so unusual and it's so evocative in terms of the imagination. It brings things really into play. Our lifetime is so short as a human being compared to what's happening on the Earth 40, 80 million years ago. Actually sounds like a long time ago, but it isn't really. In terms of the history of the Earth. So it really brings sharply into focus the enormity of time and how things change but don't change. Tropical island 40 million years ago, drowned now, but it was still a tropical island.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Final question. Now, I'm guessing there's probably the potential that there are many more missing islands that we haven't discovered yet. What's the best way to kind of discover them? I guess just more seafloor expedition?
I think so. We now have the ability using satellite gravity. We can see the morphology of the seabed. So it's not purely the bathymetry, but it's mostly so we can actually see the thousands of seamounts that there are, and we can kind of see the shape of the bigger ones. So, we could look for those in certain water depth and then go and explore them further. Map them, but go down with ROVs and have a look and see what we can find. I think that's what we need to do. And it would be fascinating to see how different islands have evolved and where they've ended up today.
Great. Well, in that case, I hope for many more accidental discoveries in the future. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much indeed, Zoe. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the podcast. To ensure you don't miss out on future episodes, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.